I've always had a decent relationship with my family, or at least I thought I did. Growing up, my parents were the kind of people who seemed to strive for fairness between me and my older brother, Jake. Sure, he was the golden child in some ways, charismatic, confident, and always the center of attention at family gatherings. But I never felt left out. At least, not until now. When Liam proposed to me last summer, I was over the moon. We'd been dating for 4 years, and I'd always dreamed of a simple, elegant wedding surrounded by friends and family. Nothing extravagant, just a day filled with love and joy. My parents had been talking about a wedding fund since I was a teenager, and my mom had even dropped hints about how they'd saved $15,000 specifically for my big day. That assurance made me feel secure as Liam and I started planning. Jake, on the other hand, had a whirlwind wedding just 2 months ago. He and Sarah, his now wife, had been together for about a year before they decided to tie the knot. Their wedding was the definition of over the top. The venue was a mansion in the countryside, decked out with cascading floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and a gourmet 5-course dinner that probably cost more than Liam and I spend on groceries in a year. On top of that, they had a 10-piece band, personalized favors for every guest, and a sparkler send-off that looked like something out of a rom-com. It was stunning, but I couldn't help but wonder how they managed to afford it. When I asked my mom about it during the wedding, she brushed it off. "Oh, Jake and Sarah covered most of it themselves," she said. "We just helped a little with the catering and flowers." I believed her. After all, Jake had a good job, and Sarah came from a well-off family. Why would I have reason to doubt her? Fast forward to 2 weeks ago. Liam and I had reached the stage where we needed to start paying deposits for our venue, photographer, and caterer. We were so excited. Everything was falling into place. I called my mom to let her know we'd need access to the wedding fund she'd been keeping for me. She got weirdly quiet on the phone. Okay. I'll transfer it to you later this week," she said, sounding nervous. Something felt off. My mom was usually quick to share updates about the fund. She'd even been the one to remind me about it when Liam and I first got engaged. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, so I decided to press her. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You sound hesitant." She sighed, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "Well, honey, there's been a bit of a complication." "What kind of complication?" There was a long pause. Then, in the most casual tone she could muster, she dropped the bombshell. "We used most of the wedding fund for Jake and Sarah's honeymoon." I swear, my brain stopped working for a second. "You what?" I finally managed to choke out. "It's not as bad as it sounds," she said quickly, as if that would make it better. Jake and Sarah had gone over budget with the wedding, and they couldn't afford the honeymoon they'd been planning. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for them, and they really deserved it. "I knew you wouldn't mind." I sat there, stunned. "You took my wedding money? The money you promised me?" "Honey, it's not like you don't have options. Liam is doing really well at work, isn't he? And your wedding doesn't need to be so expensive. It's just one day." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. My parents had made a promise to me, one they'd been reiterating for years, and they'd completely blindsided me. Worse, they'd done it for Jake, who always seemed to come first. "I can't believe you would do this," I said, my voice shaking. "How could you not even tell me?" "Jake and Sarah were in a tough spot," my mom said, as if that excused everything. "I thought you'd understand. You're always so practical." I hung up the phone before I said something I'd regret, but the damage was done. That night, I told Liam everything, and his reaction was exactly what I expected. Outrage. He couldn't fathom how my parents thought this was okay, and frankly, neither could I. That's when we made the tough decision to use some of our savings to cover the shortfall. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why should we have to sacrifice because my parents decided to bail Jake out? Why didn't Jake and Sarah offer to pay back the money? And worst of all, why did my mom act like I was the unreasonable one for being upset? The trouble started innocently enough. Liam and I were driving back from brunch, brainstorming ideas for the last few touches on our wedding. We'd already booked the venue, a cozy vineyard a little outside of town, and were debating between a live acoustic band or a DJ. The excitement in the car was contagious. For months, Everything had gone smoothly, and the thought of marrying my best friend made me feel like the luckiest person alive. The vineyard's owner had called earlier in the week to confirm that the deposit was due soon, so I decided to reach out to my mom that same afternoon. Growing up, she always emphasized how she had been saving for my wedding since I was a teenager. I remember her saying she wanted me to start my marriage off right, without the stress of a huge bill hanging over my head. It was one of the few times she ever directly compared me and Jake, my older brother, in my favor. She'd joke about how boys will just run off to Vegas, but girls deserve something magical. So, I wasn't expecting any hiccups when I called her that afternoon. The first hint that something was wrong came when I mentioned needing access to the wedding fund. "Oh," she said, dragging the word out like it was caught on something sharp. "Can you hold off just a little bit longer? I'll transfer you the money soon." "Soon? Mom, the deposit is due next week. Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then launched into a rambling explanation about how she needed to move some things around first. It didn't make sense, and the more questions I asked, the more evasive she became. Finally, I blurted out, "Mom, is there something you're not telling me?" There was a long pause. "I was going to talk to you about this eventually," she said, her voice tight, like she was trying not to snap at me. "I used some of the money, but it's not a big deal. We'll figure it out." The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge. "What do you mean you used some of the money? What for?" Her response was so casual, so matter-of-fact, it made my stomach churn. "For Jake and Sarah's honeymoon. They went over budget on the wedding, and they needed help. I figured you wouldn't mind." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother's wedding had been a spectacle, an extravagant display that Sarah had apparently planned with the help of a Pinterest board and zero regard for their actual finances. I had assumed they'd paid for the bulk of it themselves, but now it seemed my parents had been footing the bill in ways I hadn't imagined. "You figured I wouldn't mind?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Mom, that was my wedding fund." She sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "You still have some money left," she said, "and Liam does well for himself. You're not going to struggle." "That's not the point," I snapped. "You promised me that money. You've been promising me for years." Her tone shifted, growing defensive. "Jake's had a tough year, okay? His job situation hasn't been stable, and Sarah's been under a lot of stress. They deserved a nice honeymoon after everything they've been through. And what about me?" My voice cracked. "What about what I deserve?" The conversation spiraled from there. My mom refused to acknowledge how hurtful her actions were, doubling down on the idea that Jake needed the money more. When I asked why she hadn't at least told me beforehand, she accused me of being selfish. "It's just a wedding, sweetheart. It's one day. What matters is the marriage." By the time I hung up, I was shaking with anger. Liam came into the kitchen and immediately knew something was wrong. I told him everything, and his jaw clenched tighter with every word. When I finished, he pulled me into a hug and said, "We'll figure this out. You're not going to let this ruin our day." I wanted to believe him, but all I could think about was how I had spent years trusting my mom to look out for me, only to have her prioritize Jake yet again. The days after the conversation with my mom were a blur of emotions: anger, betrayal, and sadness. I couldn't shake the feeling of being sidelined yet again. Growing up, it had always been about Jake. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. While I had to fight for every ounce of attention, Jake had everything handed to him. My parents bent over backward to support him, whether it was bailing him out of bad financial decisions or smoothing over his mistakes. But this was a new low. I thought my wedding would be different, that it would finally be something that was just about me. Yet here I was, with my carefully laid plans unraveling because my mom decided my brother's needs came first. Liam, bless him, was my rock. He suggested we sit down and rework the budget together, figuring out how we could make up the shortfall without completely sacrificing the vision we had for our wedding. It helped calm me down, at least temporarily, but there was still a pit in my stomach every time I thought about how easily my mom had dismissed my feelings. A few days later, I decided to confront Jake. I wanted to hear his side of the story, to understand if he even knew where the money for his extravagant honeymoon had come from. He and Sarah had invited us over for dinner that weekend, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity. When Liam and I arrived at their house, Sarah greeted us warmly, as if nothing was wrong. She was all smiles, going on about how great their honeymoon had been and how much they'd needed the time away to reconnect. Jake seemed a little more subdued, but I wasn't sure if it was guilt or just exhaustion from his latest job drama. We sat down to eat, and I couldn't hold back any longer. "So, Jake," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, "did you know Mom used my wedding fund to pay for your honeymoon?" The room fell silent. Jake froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, while Sarah's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I explained everything. How Mom had drained almost the entire fund to cover their costs, and how she hadn't even bothered to tell me until I confronted her. As I spoke, Jake's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like guilt. I didn't know," he said slowly. "Mom didn't tell me where the money came from. She just said she'd help us out." "Are you serious?" I snapped. "You didn't think to ask? You didn't wonder how she could afford to give you thousands of dollars on top of everything else she's already done for you?" Jake looked genuinely uncomfortable, but Sarah? She didn't even try to hide her irritation. "Look," she said, "it's not like we forced her to give us the money. If she wanted to help us, that's her choice. You can't blame us for that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You don't see anything wrong with taking money that was meant for my wedding? Money that Mom has been saving for years?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "It's just money. You and Liam seem like you're doing fine. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Before I could respond, Liam cut in, his voice cold. "It's not about the money. It's about the principle. This was supposed to be something special for her, and your lack of respect is astounding." Jake looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, but Sarah just huffed and crossed her arms. "Well, excuse me for thinking your relationship was strong enough to handle a minor setback." That was it. I stood up, my hands trembling with rage. "A minor setback? Are you kidding me? You had your dream wedding and honeymoon at my expense, and you don't even have the decency to apologize? Unbelievable." I grabbed my coat and stormed out, Liam close behind me. Jake called after me, but I didn't stop. By the time we got back to the car, I was shaking, my face hot with anger. Liam started the engine but didn't say anything, giving me space to process what had just happened. That night, I blocked Sarah on social media. I couldn't deal with her smug posts about their perfect life anymore. As for Jake, I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to cut him out entirely, but another part of me held on to the hope that he'd step up and make things right. The next day, my dad called. Apparently, Jake had gone to him after our blow-up, asking for advice. "He feels bad," Dad said. "He wants to apologize." "Does he?" I replied bitterly. "Or is he just trying to avoid looking bad in front of the family?" Dad sighed. "I know you're upset, and you have every right to be, but maybe give him a chance to make amends." I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. And as for my mom, I still couldn't bring myself to speak to her. Every time I thought about her betrayal, it felt like a fresh wound reopening. I spent the next few days trying to calm myself down, but it was impossible. Every time I thought about Jake and Sarah's indifference, or my mom's blatant favoritism, it reignited the anger in me. It felt like no one truly understood the depth of what they'd done. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle, about being treated as an equal member of the family. Liam kept reminding me to focus on our plans and not let their actions ruin this exciting chapter of our lives, but the hurt was hard to shake. Then, Jake reached out. He texted me late one night, saying he wanted to meet and clear the air. I was hesitant. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but Liam encouraged me to hear him out. "Maybe he really does want to make things right," he said. "You'll feel better if you let him explain himself, even if it doesn't change anything." So, reluctantly, I agreed to meet Jake for coffee. I was already bracing for disappointment when I walked into the cafe, but his appearance surprised me. He looked genuinely stressed, dark circles under his eyes, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with something almost apologetic. "Hey," he said, standing awkwardly as I approached. "Thanks for meeting me." I sat down and crossed my arms. This better be good, Jake. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Look, I screwed up, okay? I didn't know Mom took your wedding money, I swear. But I should have asked. I should have paid more attention to where the money was coming from. I just assumed she was helping out like she always does. I stared at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Do you even realize how much damage this has caused? I asked. This wasn't just some spare cash Mom had lying around. This was something she promised me for years, something I was counting on. And now Liam and I are scrambling to make up for it. Jake looked down at his coffee cup, visibly uncomfortable. I know, and I'm sorry. I talked to Sarah about it, and we agreed to pay you back. I raised an eyebrow. Pay me back? How? We'll figure it out, he said quickly. It might take a little time, but I don't want you to feel like you've been cheated. You deserve that money, and we'll make it right. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he said it felt half-hearted. And Sarah's okay with this? I asked skeptically. Jake hesitated. She's coming around. She knows we owe you, even if she doesn't like admitting it. That was all I needed to hear. Jake, if Sarah doesn't take this seriously, then what's the point? I'm not going to sit around waiting for you two to come around. Either you make this right, or you don't. But don't expect me to keep forgiving you if you don't follow through. He nodded, looking genuinely ashamed. You're right. I'll talk to her again. I don't want this to ruin our relationship, okay? You're my sister, and I hate that things have gotten so messed up between us. I sighed, feeling some of my anger start to thaw. I don't want that either, Jake. But you need to understand how much this hurt me. And it's not just you. It's Mom, too. She's been playing favorites our whole lives, and this just pushed me over the edge. Jake looked genuinely taken aback. Mom plays favorites? With me? I laughed bitterly. Are you serious? Jake, she's always treated you like the golden child. Do you have any idea how many times she's told me to be more like you? How she's been over backward to cover for your mistakes, while I've had to figure everything out on my own. He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. Instead, he nodded slowly. I guess I never really thought about it like that, he admitted. But you're right. She does treat us differently. And that's not fair to you. Hearing him acknowledge it felt like a small victory, but it didn't erase the damage. I appreciate you saying that, I said. But words only go so far. If you really want to fix this, you need to act. Jake promised he would, but I wasn't holding my breath. After everything that had happened, it was hard to trust him, or anyone else in my family, for that matter. Back at home, I told Liam about the conversation, and he was cautiously optimistic. It sounds like he's starting to understand, he said, but I get why you're still wary. Let's just focus on what we can control for now. And that's what we did. We revised our budget again, cutting back on a few things and finding creative ways to save money. It wasn't the wedding we had originally envisioned, but it was still ours, and that was what mattered. Meanwhile, my mom's behavior continued to baffle me. She kept trying to act like nothing had happened, sending me texts about wedding decorations and asking when I'd be coming over for dinner. I ignored most of her messages, but one day, she called and caught me off guard. I feel like you're avoiding me, she said, her tone tinged with guilt. Can we talk? I don't want this to come between us. The phone call with my mom was the last straw. Come between us? I repeated, my voice trembling. Mom, you made this come between us. You took the money you promised me, lied about it, and gave it to Jake without even telling me. How do you expect me to just get over that? She sighed, the kind of long, dramatic sigh she always gave when she wanted to make me feel guilty. I didn't think it would cause such a big issue. You're acting like I did this to hurt you. Whether you meant to or not, you did hurt me, I snapped. And what's worse is that you still don't seem to care. Do you know how humiliating it was to find out that my own mother doesn't value me as much as my brother? You keep trying to brush this under the rug like it's no big deal, but it is a big deal. There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought I'd finally gotten through to her. But then she said, well, you're making me out to be the bad guy here, and that's not fair. I just wanted to help Jake. You don't know what it's like to see your child struggle. I couldn't believe it. Struggle? Mom, Jake had a luxury wedding and a honeymoon in the Maldives. Meanwhile, I'm cutting corners just to afford the basics for my wedding because you stole from me. Do you even hear yourself? Her voice wavered. You don't understand. Jake's always needed more support. And I've always been the one who didn't, I interrupted. Because you never gave me the chance. You've been coddling Jake his whole life, and I've had to fend for myself. Well, guess what? I'm done being the afterthought. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but I felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time, I'd stood my ground and refused to let her guilt me into submission. Jake did follow through on his promise, kind of. A week later, he Venmo'd me $1,000 with a note that said, a start. It was something, but it wasn't enough to repair the years of favoritism or the damage caused by this latest betrayal. Sarah, predictably, had nothing to say. She blocked me on social media after Jake told her about our conversation, and I figured that was for the best. As for my mom, she sent a series of half apologies over the next few weeks. She would text things like, I hope we can move past this, or, families fight, but we always come back together. I didn't respond to any of them. Liam and I had decided to put some distance between us and my family, at least for now. It wasn't worth the constant stress and heartbreak. Our wedding day ended up being perfect, even if it wasn't what we had originally planned. We scaled back the guest list, opted for simpler decorations, and skipped some of the extras, but none of that mattered. What mattered was standing at the altar with Liam, surrounded by people who truly cared about us, and starting our life together on our terms. My dad was the only member of my immediate family who came. He walked me down the aisle, tears in his eyes, and told me how proud he was of me. You deserve all the happiness in the world, he whispered, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Months later, Jake and I were able to rebuild some semblance of a relationship. He continued making small payments toward the money he owed me, though it was clear Sarah wasn't happy about it. My mom, on the other hand, remained distant. She never fully apologized or took responsibility for her actions, and I realized I couldn't keep chasing the validation she was unwilling to give. Now, I focus on the family I'm building with Liam, the one where love and respect are mutual. The hurt my mom caused will always be a part of my story, but it doesn't define me. I've learned to set boundaries and stand up for myself, even when it's uncomfortable. And for the first time in my life, I feel free.